attendance been on these?
So we're averaging about 25 farmers per meeting,
Okay.
which is in one way, you know, very encouraging because it's a great small conversation. In another way, I'd love to be able to talk to a lot more farmers about the topic.
That's right, because all farmers really need to know about this topic.
For sure.
All right, and why is that?
Because what we're talking about at these workshops is the herbicide strategy, which is something that the EPA has come out with. And there's a lot of policy conversations. There's a lot of these things I think are of interest to a lot of guys. But when it gets down to it, why farmers need to know is because they're going to see changes to their herbicide labels. They've already seen some examples of changes to the labels and around Endangered Species Act obligations, and it's going to change how they farm.
And do farmers really know? What would you guess that farmers probably are really not aware of what the impact of this is?
I think that the majority of farmers are not fully up to date on the impact of the herbicide strategy. Yes. Yeah. That said, why we did these 5 talks over the last 2 weeks and why we're planning on doing more is because now's the time for them to start getting prepared. It's not coming at them all at once. So as long as they're learning about it now and starting to think about how to prepare themselves, there's still plenty of time to get ready.
Okay. What is going to be the first thing that hits them? What change? You said changes have already started. But
yeah, so perfect example. The only example currently that we have in a soybean situation is Liberty Ultra, which was registered last year and has a herbicide strategy component to its label. So that's already in place. Some restrictions on Liberty Ultra that farmers are going to see is they're going to have runoff and erosion mitigations where they have to make sure that they have certain part of the point system. They're going to have a certain amount of points to ensure that they can use Liberty Ultra in specific field situations. There are also drift components to Liberty Ultra that I think it will give some farmers pause. Things like a 10-foot mandatory buffer downwind, a 50-foot downwind buffer if you're applying aerial, some broad things that just people are going to have to think about before they do the work.
All right. What is coming up next? Do we know yet?
So the EPA has provided a list of pesticides or herbicides in the order that they're going to come up in registration. We don't know the specific order that things are going to come up because we also know that the EPA has indicated that as part of their court settlement that they're going to push things through rapidly. So there's a list, and if things came up naturally over the registration process and the re-registration process, we know how things would come. But since we're expecting the EPA to move things faster than expected or than anticipated, we don't really know specifically. But I know, 2,4-D is going to be on the list. Roundup, glyphosate, dicamba, all these things that we use on a regular basis in Illinois are all going to be eventually come under the herbicide strategy label. And then in this year, in the next few months, we're going to see the insecticide strategy get published. And then we're going to start seeing label changes to insecticide products. So.
And fungicide down the way?
Yeah, and fungicide in 2026. Yep.
Okay.
So lots of conversations moving forward.
So really, anybody who applies a crop protectant in some way or another then is probably going to need to make sure that they know what's on that label and observe those rules.
Yeah, so I would just caveat that comment with, right now the EPA has focused on agriculture uses of crop protection products. So homeowner use, golf courses, these are not targeted right now under the strategies, and that's just because the EPA has to focus on where the most pesticides are being applied. But at some point, we expect all these uses to also have to have label components.
You mentioned a while ago a point system.
Yeah.
And I think when there was a survey taken by maybe CoBank, I don't remember, that farmers, there were only a quarter of the farmers were able to get enough points to be somewhat prepared or indicate that they were going to be able to observe those rules?
Yeah, so the point system if we use herbicide strategy as an example, the point system basically says that every product as it comes up for re-registration or a new product comes up for registration, the EPA is going to assign it a point requirement, a mitigation point requirement, 0 to 9. The idea being that 9 is the most mitigation points that you would need, and that's for a product that's especially concerning to the EPA. And the idea is then on every field that you operate on, you're going to have to look at that field and then decide, how do I get to these points? And so reasonably, we're expecting most herbicide products to require 6 points. When I talk to farmers, I very much recommend that they try to look at every field and go through the details of the herbicide strategy and try to think about, how do we get to 9 points on a field? There's a couple caveats to that. First off, we know that not every field in Illinois will require runoff and erosion restrictions. So if a field's 1,000 feet from a protected area, so it's a field in the middle of a bunch of other agriculture fields, it may not have any mitigation requirements on it. And so that's really great for a lot of farmers. And I think I've seen estimates that it could be over 50% of ag fields in Illinois might meet that qualification. So that's good to know. But what I'm concerned about are the fields that are next to waterways, next to a drainage ditch, next to tree stands, that are going to have a lot of struggles meeting these requirements. And I want farmers to start looking at those fields now, while there's only the Liberty Ultra is the only label out there now. But so there's no need to panic, but let's start looking at it now and thinking about, how will I get to 9 points on those fields? And that's what we did with the workshops. We sat down and talked about that.
Did the farmers react to you, those ones that attended the workshops? Did they react to you that, oh, this will be easy, or this will be a real headache?
No, they did not. My message what I really want to communicate to people is that this is something that we can comply with. We can do this if we do thought. But no, that was not the reaction of most farmers. The real burden, I think, is not so much can we get to, for example, 9 points. We've walked through a lot of example fields. Getting to 9 points, if you're willing to do something like reduced tillage, no tillage, cover cropping, you can get there relatively easy. A lot of fields you can probably get there even without those kind of infield practices. But the challenge is the record keeping component. So a farmer might look at the list of the mitigation practices and think, oh yeah, for sure I can do this, I can meet these requirements, but we just don't have clarity on what record keeping do they need to do. How does a farmer prove that they did these practices on their field, and how are they supposed to communicate that with their partners? So a great example is, our big question about this is, who's legally responsible, right? And I think that in a lot of ways, the legal responsibility is going to fall on whoever's applying the pesticide, because we're dealing with a pesticide label issue. But the farmer is still responsible for hitting these mitigation requirements, because they're going to have to communicate to their custom applicators or their ag retail partners and say, yes, these mitigations have been met, and I'm going to prove that to you this way, for the custom applicators to be willing to go out there and do it. Now, if they're applying themselves, that's a different situation. But that record-keeping component, that's the real burden. I've heard a lot of people talk about, how do I know what records to keep? What are the right records to keep? How long to keep my records? So things like, how do I prove that I did cover crops on a field? I mean, and if you plant cover crops in the fall, expecting to get 2 mitigation points, but then that cover crop doesn't come up in the spring, which we all know sometimes it doesn't work out. How do I prove that? What does that mean for me in terms of meeting my requirements? And these are all questions that we don't have perfect answers to at this point.
Do you feel that the change in administration in Washington will have any impact on either rules or speed of implementation, or any impact on things that you've been teaching the folks so far?
So I attend a lot of national meetings, and that's a big topic right now. Will the Trump administration change things? I guess my general opinion is that the new administration change may have the ability to soften some of the changes, maybe slow down the rate at which things are hitting farmers. That said, because the EPA they settled a court case, and they agreed to do this, there's a court order in place that really they're going to have to comply with. There's also an aspect of this, which is that we have to be aware of the fact that if the EPA does not come into compliance with Endangered Species Act, which they've admitted that they're not in compliance under their current system, the courts only really have one option, which is to pull labels. And so I like to ask growers, would you rather not have access to a product at all, or would you rather take some mitigation options and at least maintain access? And we saw last year with dicamba, courts have the authority to pull products completely out of the hands of growers. And so we want to avoid that situation.
What would you like farmers to know that's most important here? Is it the need for education? And if so, what do they need to learn for this coming growing season, if it's just Liberty Ultra or being prepared for the future?
Yeah, so I think the message that I like to take to farmers, one thing first off I stress to folks is, in this situation, the EPA is not necessarily the bad guy. Okay, they're a regulatory body that's in the middle of two groups trying to push around pesticide policy. Okay, and so they're trying to implement a compromise that works. And we've seen it's not a perfect situation. I'm in no way saying that, but we've seen examples where the EPA has taken steps to try to soften this already for farmers, and we hope that we see that more. But that said, if you're applying Liberty Ultra, you need to be aware of the uniqueness of that label and plan for that accordingly. That's going to be, if you're using Liberty Ultra this year, you need to be aware of that this year. The other thing you need to think about is that, everything from the drift mitigations, which we haven't really talked about yet, but the drift mitigations to the runoff and erosion mitigations, they're achievable goals. We can find ways around it, but we have to, or maybe not around it, we can find ways to comply, but we have to plan for it. And so starting to think about that now, one thing I say to every farmer and every workshop that we've been in is you need to pull out every field you look at or you work on and take a look at it and make a plan. And a lot of those fields, you're going to look at them and say, I don't need to do anything. And you need to find the problem fields now so you can put things in place ahead of time. 2025, probably not going to be a big issue for a lot of guys. 26, 27, we're going to see it become more and more complicated. So why not get started now?
Okay. On the drift mitigation, that farmers started thinking about that when dicamba was really first introduced, and so I think a lot of them are already thinking about it. But how is there anything different as far as the Endangered Species Act?
Yeah. So with the herbicide strategy, what it is looking at from a drift mitigation standpoint is basically every product where the EPA is concerned about it, they're going to give a buffer. And that buffer can be anywhere from 0 to 300 feet, depending on the type of product and the way you're applying it, aerial versus ground. And basically after that point, so the EPA is going to put a buffer on the label, and you have to have that buffer, or you can adopt mitigation practices to make that buffer smaller. And so like Liberty Ultra, for example, we saw a 10-foot ground application buffer or a 50-foot aerial application buffer. If farmers move to a coarser spray droplet size, they can reduce that buffer. Right. For ground applications, if they have a windbreak around the downwind of their field, that buffer goes away completely. If they move to a hooded sprayer, that buffer goes away completely in a ground application. The struggle that I have is that, or the struggle that actually I heard from a lot of farmers, is we in Illinois, we just don't have a lot of true windbreaks around our fields. You've been around long enough to know that, Stu. And so getting rid of that 10-foot buffer when a ground application is going to be a real struggle for a lot of guys. And I'll admit that in these talks, one thing I learned is I went into this thinking, well, 10 foot's manageable. We can deal with 10 foot. And I said that a lot to farmers. And the immediate feedback I got was 10 foot's a problem right off the bat too. Like 10 foot is not manageable in their minds because we're worried about weed growth in those areas, things like that. And the most common solution that I had farmers tell me, oh, well, what I'll do is I'll go back and spray it when the wind's blowing in a different direction, the buffer. Well, that causes a lot of complications because now you got to schedule that application. You got to wait for the right time when the wind's blowing the right way, and then you got to document that you did that, right? So that record keeping component comes back in, that timing and scheduling. And a lot of times when we're spraying, we don't have a lot of extra time. Like it's not, it doesn't work with us that way. And there's a lot of components there. I mean, we saw one big issue we saw with drift. We've already seen is things around like, how do I take a wind measurement? Is the wind blowing in the correct direction, the correct speed? And also, if I take that measurement in the field, it might tell me in the field that I'm blowing in the right direction. But what we saw with dicamba is a perfect example. They want you to look at the nearest weather station. Well, what's happening at that weather station may be 10 miles away, and we all know that the wind speed and direction can change over 10 miles real fast. So there's a lot of considerations thinking.
At one event that I was at, it was a CCA event that I've forgotten. Well, the CCA organization put it on. There's a Fish and Wildlife fellow who was there. You probably have run into him because he says he's managing all of this for Fish and Wildlife in this territory. And I'd asked, what's the main message? And he says, my main message is if you have an endangered species on your farm, keep doing what you're doing because it's going to be okay.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that seems to be contradictory to what we've heard everywhere else.
Yeah, so I want to be really, really clear on this point because I have gotten the question, should I go tear out things that look like habitat by my fields? You know, if I planted milkweed somewhere to create pollinator habitat, should I go tear that out now? I'm in no way suggesting that farmers need to do something like that. I think that right now we do not have clarity on if areas that I have created, so created pollinator, created protected species habitat, we don't have clarity on whether or not that counts or doesn't count against farmers. My anticipation is that we're going to get some clarity that says that if you created the habitat, so like in a CRP situation, a bee habitat or something like that, you're probably going to be okay, and they're going to find a way to make sure it doesn't count against you. It doesn't work against you when it comes to compliance. But we have not been told that officially in any way. So I want to be clear. That's my expectation. That's not been made clear by the EPA or by any other regulator at this point. Does that make sense? Maybe I should say that's my hope. I'm just going to add to that, just sorry. I will say that the EPA and the Fish and Wildlife Service have both told me directly that their goal is they want to continue encouraging farmers to adopt building new habitats. Their goal is not to work against that, to discourage farmers from having habitat near their fields. So I am sincere when I say I think we're going to find a way to solve that, but we haven't been told officially yet. And so we have to be aware of, if it's not in writing, it's not law yet.
What have we not talked about that you want farmers to know?
I'll just reiterate that it's something that we can do if we get prepared and work on it and start thinking about it, but it's not going to be easy. We have to do record keeping. We have to look at every field and think about every field. The next big thing there's a couple big things that worry me. Probably the most concerning is the question of how things are going to be evaluated. So I've heard other people say this, and I'll go on record as saying it too. I am not aware of any endangered or listed species being pushed to extinction due to pesticide use in the U.S. That said, I know that there's been situations where listed species have been pressured by pesticide use but never gone to extinction. And so I'm concerned about how do we continue in 10 years if we look back and say what was success. Well, if it's just stuff continues to not go extinct, that's a hard thing to measure. So I think from an ag world, we have to really think about how is this going to be evaluated. And I think we also have to remember that the EPA fought this court case that ended in a settlement in 2023 for almost 10 years. And the reason I bring that up is because we have to remember that the agency is not the one pushing this. They're the one implementing it, but they're implementing it because there's another side that is forcing that implementation to happen. And we have to look over at that side and say, what is going to satisfy them? What does success look like to them? And I'm worried that success looks like to them decreasing pesticide use or no pesticide use. And in Illinois, we're going to have a challenge decreasing our pesticide use to zero. I mean, that's just a huge challenge. And so we have to just be aware of that. I don't want to be a Chicken Little situation, but we just have to be aware of that. The other thing that I think everyone has to know about is the fact that we haven't seen state rulemaking yet. So IDOA is going to have to go in and talk about and make rules, Illinois Department of Agriculture, about how they're going to enforce this in the state. And they haven't done that yet. And so there's going to be a lot of conversations that need to happen with IDOA about how can we reasonably implement this on our farms.